The crisp, conditioned air of the downtown law firm felt suffocating. You sat in a high-backed leather chair, listening to the monotonous drone of your late uncle's attorney. Across the massive mahogany table sat your step-cousin, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched under his skin. He was the golden child, the one who had spent his entire life grooming himself to take over the multi-billion-dollar corporate empire. But your uncle, an eccentric and deeply paranoid man, had always seen through the facade. When the lawyer finally looked up from the will, the room fell completely silent. The entire estate, the liquid assets, the controlling shares, and the crown jewel, a remote, uncharted private island in the South Pacific, were left entirely to you. There was only one condition. To prove you possessed the resilience required to manage his empire, you had to spend exactly 7 days alone on the island, surviving off the land and the estate's minimal provisions. Only after those 7 days would the transfer of power be legally binding. You watched the stepson's face contort into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He didn't scream. He didn't argue. He simply stood up, adjusted his perfectly tailored suit, gave you a cold, hollow stare, and walked out of the room. You should have known right then that the terms of the will were the least of your problems. 48 hours later, a twin-engine seaplane was dropping you off in paradise. The water was a blinding, crystalline turquoise, lapping gently against pristine white sand. The dense, emerald-green jungle rose sharply from the beach, wrapping around a towering volcanic peak in the center of the island. The pilot helped you unload a small waterproof bag containing a flint, a canteen, a machete, and a basic first aid kit. He gave you a brief salute, climbed back into the cockpit, and within minutes, the hum of the engine disappeared into the clouds. You were entirely alone. Or so you thought. The first day was spent exploring the perimeter. Your uncle had built a sprawling, modernist glass and steel mansion near the cliffs, but the will dictated it was locked down. You were meant to survive the elements, relying on a small open-air cabana near the tree line. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and violet, the serenity of the island began to feel heavy, oppressive. You built a small fire on the beach, the crackle of burning driftwood, the only sound competing with the crashing waves. That was when you noticed it. Out on the dark horizon, a shadow detached itself from the gloom. It was a matte black speedboat, running without lights, cutting silently through the waves toward the far side of the island. Your stomach tied itself into a cold, heavy knot. The estate was supposed to be completely restricted airspace and waters. You kicked sand over your fire, plunging yourself into darkness, and retreated into the thick canopy of the jungle. The tropical heat was stifling, the air thick with humidity and the chaotic hum of insects. You moved carefully, your eyes adjusting to the moonlight filtering through the massive palm leaves. It didn't take long to find them. Looking down from a rocky ridge, you saw the glow of tactical flashlights cutting through the underbrush. There were 6 of them. They moved with terrifying, practiced precision. They wore unmarked tactical gear, carrying suppressed automatic rifles and thermal optics. This wasn't a test designed by your uncle. This was a hit squad, and there was only one person who had the money, the motive, and the timing to send them. The stepson. If you disappeared on this island, the will would be voided, and the empire would default entirely to him. The realization hit you like a physical blow. You were completely unarmed, hundreds of miles from civilization, and being hunted by professionals. A2 began with a relentless, driving rainstorm. The weather was a blessing in disguise, washing away your tracks and masking the sound of your movements. You spent the morning moving higher into the volcanic mountains, using the treacherous terrain to your advantage. The mercenaries were sweeping the lowlands, their voices occasionally carrying over the wind. They were frustrated. They had expected a quick, easy job, a terrified civilian cowering on the beach. They hadn't expected you to vanish into the terrain. You found an old natural cave system tucked behind a waterfall near the center of the island. It provided shelter and a tactical vantage point. You knew you couldn't fight them directly. You had to outlast them. You had to survive until the extraction boat arrived on the morning of the 7th day. But as you sat in the damp, dark cave, chewing on bitter palm hearts, a new thought took root in your mind. Surviving wasn't enough. If you just hid, the stepson would simply try again when you returned to the city. You needed proof. You needed to expose him. By day 3, the hunters grew desperate. They began using tracking dogs, but the torrential rains and the island's sheer volume of wildlife confused their sense. You began to study their patrol routes. They worked in pairs, communicating via shortwave radios. You noticed that one pair always patrolled the rocky eastern cliffs, an area dense with slippery moss and unstable footing. You spent the entire night weaving heavy vines across a narrow choke point on the cliff path, anchoring them to a massive, rotting log suspended dangerously close to the edge. When morning broke, you intentionally snapped a thick branch near their patrol route and immediately retreated up the incline. The 2 mercenaries took the bait, rushing forward with their weapons raised. As the lead man stepped into the choke point, you released the tension on the vine. The massive log swung down from the canopy with devastating force. It caught the lead mercenary square in the chest, sweeping him off his feet and sending him tumbling down the steep, muddy embankment into a deep ravine. His partner panicked, firing blindly into the trees, the suppressed shots sounding like aggressive snaps in the humid air, while the second man scrambled down the ravine to check on his injured partner. You slipped out from the brush and grabbed the heavy tactical radio the lead man had dropped on the path. You melted back into the shadows just as the second man climbed back up, shouting into the empty jungle. Now you had ears. For the next 2 days, you became a ghost. You listened to their radio chatter, learning their names, their formations, and their mounting frustration. You learned that the extraction boat, your ride home, was scheduled to arrive at dawn on day 7 at the southern dock. You also learned that the stepson was personally communicating with the squad leader via an encrypted satellite phone, demanding updates and throwing furious tantrums over their failure to find you. Day 5 brought a brutal heatwave. The jungle felt like an oven. You were exhausted, your muscles aching, your skin covered in scratches and insect bites, but your mind was hyper-focused. They were down to 4 active hunters, and they were exhausted, paranoid, and making mistakes. That evening, you decided to turn the tables entirely. You used your machete to hollow out several thick bamboo stalks, filling them with dry, fibrous kindling and spark-producing rocks you found near the volcano. You strategically placed these crude noisemakers around their makeshift base camp near the shoreline. In the dead of night, you triggered a small tripwire that sent a cascade of rocks tumbling down a nearby hill. As the mercenaries rushed toward the noise, you slipped into their camp. You didn't want their weapons. You wouldn't know how to use them effectively anyway. You wanted the prize. Sitting on a folding table inside the leader's tent was the encrypted satellite phone. You grabbed it, your heart hammering against your ribs. You quickly scrolled through the recent logs and found an audio recording app. The leader had been recording his calls with the stepson as an insurance policy. You pressed play. The stepson's arrogant whining voice filled the small earpiece, explicitly detailing the bounty on your head, the instructions to make it look like an accident, and his plans to take over the board of directors once your demise was confirmed. You quickly transferred the audio files to your own encrypted cloud server using the satellite uplink, a desperate gamble that the signal would push through the heavy cloud cover. It took 3 agonizing minutes. The progress bar crawled. Outside, you heard the mercenaries shouting, realizing they had been diverted by a distraction. They were running back toward the camp. Just as the progress bar hit 100%, a flashlight beam swept across the front of the tent. You shoved the satellite phone into your pocket, slashed a hole in the back of the heavy canvas tent with your machete, and dove into the dense ferns just as the squad leader tore the front flap open. "Find him," the leader roared, his voice cracking with panic. "He was just here. He has the phone." Day 6 was a relentless, terrifying pursuit. The jungle became a high-speed chessboard. The mercenaries abandoned all caution, tearing through the foliage, firing blindly at shifting shadows. You didn't stop moving for 18 hours. You used every trick you had learned, doubling back on your own tracks, wading through waist-deep swamps to lose any remaining scent, and climbing high into the canopy to hide while they rushed past directly below you. The physical toll was immense. Every breath felt like inhaling fire, and your vision blurred from dehydration and lack of sleep. But you had the evidence. You had the key to everything. The morning of day 7 arrived with a thick, haunting fog rolling in off the ocean. The gray mist settled over the island, reducing visibility to less than 20 feet. This was it. The extraction boat was due at the southern dock at 0600 hours. The mercenaries knew this too. They would be waiting. You approached the southern bay with agonizing slowness. Through the swirling fog, you could barely make out the silhouette of the massive wooden dock. And there they were. The 4 remaining hunters were fanned out across the beach, their weapons raised, scanning the tree line. They had the dock completely locked down. At exactly 0600, the deep, rhythmic thrum of a heavy diesel engine echoed across the water. The extraction boat was arriving. The squad leader raised his hand, signaling his men to hold their positions. They planned to take you out the moment you broke cover, and then deal with the boat crew. You needed a diversion. You needed total chaos. Throughout the night, you had gathered armfuls of dry palm fronds and soaked them in a small puddle of leaked fuel you found near the estate. Spack-up generator. You piled the massive, soaked bundle near a cluster of old, hollowed-out oil drums at the edge of the tree line. Striking your flint against the steel of your machete, you sent a shower of sparks into the fuel-soaked leaves. The fire caught instantly, roaring to life with a fierce, blinding intensity. Within seconds, the flames reached the hollowed drums, creating a massive echoing boom that shook the ground. The fog lit up in a terrifying shade of orange. The mercenaries panicked, spinning toward the explosion, their discipline shattering. They fired wildly into the inferno, blinded by the sudden light and disoriented by the concussive noise. This was your window. You burst from the underbrush on the complete opposite side of the beach. Your legs pumped like pistons, kicking up wet sand as you sprinted toward the water. The boat was just pulling alongside the dock, the captain looking on in sheer terror at the burning tree line. "Wait!" You screamed, your voice raw and broken. The squad leader heard you. He whipped around, bringing his rifle up to his shoulder. You didn't slow down. You dove headfirst off the end of the dock, crashing into the freezing ocean, just as the sharp cracks of suppressed gunfire whipped through the air where you had been a second before. You swam entirely underwater, your lungs screaming for oxygen, until your hands slammed against the smooth fiberglass hull of the extraction boat. You broke the surface, gasping for air, and grabbed the boarding ladder. The crew, realizing what was happening, hauled you over the railing. "Get us out of here." You choked out, collapsing onto the metal deck. "Now!" The captain didn't hesitate. He slammed the throttles forward, the heavy engines roaring in protest as the boat tore away from the dock. You lay on your back, staring up at the gray sky, listening to the fading sound of the mercenaries shouting on the distant beach. You reached into your soaked pocket, your fingers closing around the cold, heavy plastic of the satellite phone. You had won. 3 weeks later, the atmosphere in the corporate boardroom was entirely different. You stood at the head of the massive glass table, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. The heavy oak doors swung open, and 2 federal agents escorted your step-cousin into the room. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit today. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands heavily restrained, his face pale and hollow. The audio files you had uploaded from the island had been completely irrefutable. The conspiracy, the hired mercenaries, the financial wire transfers, it was all perfectly documented. The authorities had raided the island hours after you escaped, arresting the remaining squad members who quickly flipped on their employer to save themselves. The stepson was facing multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. He stopped walking, looking at you with a mixture of disbelief and utter defeat. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but the words failed him. You didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. You simply offered a calm, silent nod and motioned for the agents to take him away. As the doors closed behind him, the lawyer from your uncle's firm stepped forward, placing a thick leather binder on the table. "The transition is complete," the lawyer said, his voice carrying a new tone of absolute respect. "The estate, the holdings, and the board are fully under your control. Where would you like to begin?" You looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city move far below. You thought about the oppressive heat of the jungle, the blinding fog, and the mechanical click of the rifles. You had walked into the fire and come out forged in steel. "We have a lot of work to do," you said quietly, pulling the leather binder toward you.